Welcome to another installment of Opening the Writer's Desk, where we take a deep dive into writing tips from today's most widely read authors. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at author Toni Morrison and the techniques that she's used in her own writing. I'm going to start by saying, big surprise, I'm a big Toni Morrison fan. I love the way her writing balances the brutal with the lyrical and the gut-wrenching moments with the tender moments. She's best known as the author of novels like Beloved, and she's someone we can all learn from. So I'm excited to share with you some tips straight from her desk today. Tip number one is to write what you want to read. Toni Morrison did this herself, and I think it's one of the reasons why all of her work to me feels so revolutionary and new, even all these years later. Morrison herself said, "I wrote the book The Bluest Eye because I wanted to read it. I thought that kind of book with that subject, those most vulnerable, most undescribed, not taken seriously little black girls, had never existed seriously in literature. No one had ever written about them except as props. Since I couldn't find a book that did that, I thought, well, I'll write it and then I'll read it." It was really the reading impulse that got me into the writing thing. End quote. I love that. I say to writers who I work with all the time how important it is for them to remind themselves that there's a reason why they're telling this story and not somebody else. Your book is your vision, and you're the only one who has the vision. We all deserve the chance to pick up, the exact book that we want to read. And if you don't see it, well, maybe you should write it. I certainly relate. All of my novels have been books I wanted to read. So ask yourself, if you're not sure what direction to go with your book, or if you have a few ideas you're choosing from, what do I most want to read? Tip number two from Morrison is that the best writing process is whatever works for you. If there's one thing I tell all the writers I work with over and over, it's that every writer is different. No one is going to have the same writing process as somebody else because we all have different needs, different strengths, and different schedules. Writers, we derail ourselves a lot of the time because we think we need to conform to a particular method of doing things, especially when we Google writing tips or read interviews and see things like a writer must write every day, or claims that you need a ritual, like lighting a candle or whatever. I have never lit a candle, by the way. Actually, I did once and it gave me a headache, so I never did it again. In reality, we work best when we do what works best for us, not what works best for somebody else. I love this quote from Morrison. She says, "I tell my students one of the most important things they need to know is when they are at their best creatively, they need to ask themselves, what does the ideal room look like? Is there music? Is there silence? Is there chaos outside, or is there serenity outside? What do I need in order to release my imagination?" I was recently being interviewed on a podcast about my writing process, and until this podcast host was asking me this question, I had never realized that I have never once, not once, worked on one of my novels at a desk. I have a desk. I actually have a couple of desks. And the desk I currently have, I love. I work there, I take meetings there, but I cannot write there. I write on couches, I write on pool chairs, I write in cafes, on my front lawn, I've written in bed. I write where I am and where inspiration strikes, but for some reason a desk doesn't do it for me. Back in New York, when I was working on my novel Privilege with a newborn at home, I had to leave the house during my precious writing time because we lived in a small apartment and it was summer and too hot for my baby, who was just a few weeks old, to go anywhere. So I sometimes wound up at bars, like a bar, with regulars drinking beers and watching sports channels. And there I was with my maternity bra on and my notebook, writing a novel about some college girls, in front of a lukewarm glass of white wine until I had to go home. One afternoon doing this, I had no idea what to write, but I had a page goal I had to meet for the day. And so I just started describing the men sitting around me. That scene became a scene in my novel, Privilege. Now in my novel, it takes place in a diner and there's more that happens, of course. It wasn't what was actually happening in this bar on this July afternoon in Queens, but the diners in the scene in my novel were the men sitting around me that day. This is all to say, We write where we can, and we should allow ourselves the freedom to find a place where the words flow, even if that's somewhere out of the ordinary. Tip number 3 from Morrison is to be open to what your writing can tell you. Morrison says it's that being open, not scratching for it, not digging for it, not constructing something, but being open to the situation and trusting that what you don't know will be available to you. It is bigger than your overt consciousness or your intelligence or even your gifts. It is out there somewhere and you have to let it in. Ugh, I love this one so much. I believe that a huge part of writing is simply being open, just like she does. Not trying to control it, not trying to generate it solely out of the same part of our brains that we use to make, grocery lists and PowerPoint presentations. That kind of writing, I sometimes call writing by spreadsheet, this drive to over control things. And it's understandable to think that that's how it should be done because it's how so much work in contemporary society is done. But it doesn't work for creativity. We end up over-structuring our writing. We use outlines or extremely detailed character profiles, or we do months and months of planning so that by the time we're writing, it feels confined and confining. Nothing is surprising because we're not letting our writing surprise us. But when we let go of that control a little and let ourselves be guided by the writing itself and our characters, we can stumble into something bigger than we could have imagined otherwise. When I'm open, I am always surprised by what I discover, and it's almost invariably better than what I could have come up with on my own. Okay, I have 2 more great tips from Toni Morrison for you, but before I share them, I just want to invite you to apply to my program, the Book Incubator. The link is down below this video. It's just 2 questions, takes under 5 minutes, and if you're writing a book, you'll definitely want to check it out. Now back to the video. Tip number 4 is to know when to let go. I know this is going to be probably a tough one, calling all perpetual revisers. It can be hard to know when it's time to let your writing go and put it out into the world. Maybe that means finally submitting your manuscript to literary agents, or if you get that book deal, finally letting the manuscript go to print. And while you should give your work the time it deserves to get where you want it to be, you can't spend forever just editing into oblivion. As Toni Morrison says, the quote is, "Those paragraphs that need reworking, I do as long as I can." I mean, I've revised 6 times, 7 times, 13 times. But there's a line between revision and fretting, just working it to death. It's important to know when you are fretting it. When you are fretting it because it's not working, it needs to be scrapped. If you know deep down something is not working, dump it. But if you're just reworking for the sake of reworking, maybe let yourself stop and be done. Maybe even reward yourself with some tea or a massage. Honestly, I'm never done with my books. I mean, even when I do book readings, I'm not reading the words on the page when I'm reading at an event. I tweak them as I go. I mean, it's close, but I'm making small changes. And I think this is normal. I think it's normal for a writer never to be done revising. We don't let it go because it's done. We let it go because it's time. And finally, tip number 5 from Morrison is to do what you can with what you have. Okay, here's our last quote from Morrison. She says, "I have an ideal writing routine that I've never experienced, which is to have, say, 9 uninterrupted days when I wouldn't have to leave the house or take phone calls. But I'm not able to write regularly. I've never been able to do that, mostly because I've always had a 9-to-5 job. I had to write either in between those hours hurriedly or spend a lot of weekend and pre-dawn time." Here's a fun fact. Before she published her first novel, Morrison made history as the first Black female editor at Random House in New York City. And she's considered to be a huge influence on Black American literature, not just as an author, but also in her role as editor in the 60s and 70s. Aside from having that literary influence, her time as an editor also shows us that it's possible to write books while holding down a demanding full-time job. As she says here, it's not easy, but it is possible. I've worked with one writer who's a doctor, and she wrote the first draft of her book on the Notes app of her phone in between seeing patients. I worked with another one who wrote her draft in her car while waiting to pick up her kids from soccer practice. Even if the circumstances aren't ideal, you can write a book without having, 24 hours of the day to yourself. And that's probably a good thing. Life is imperfectly designed for authoring books, but that doesn't have to stop you. If you made it this far in the video, I'm guessing that you are writing a book or you want to write a book. And if so, I would love to hear from you. When I'm not writing, my mission is to help writers write their dream books. I love it. If you're curious to know more, I have a free video walking you through my exact process for writing a book. You can get it by clicking below and answering 2 questions to apply to my program, the Book Incubator. You can get the video whether you join the program or not. There's no pressure to enroll. So just click the link below, tell me a little bit about you and your book or your book idea. I'm so excited to hear from you.